Hello, thanks for joining me. This is the third video in a series about the graves at Cilrhedyn Churchyard, which is being cleared of undergrowth after years of neglect. Most of the first gravestones we see as we enter the churchyard are to the families who lived just along the road at Blaenpibydd Farm. The farmers of Blaenpibydd were buried here for at least 155 years. This table tomb is very worn now, but the inscription commemorates 2 generations of these farmers. The first mentioned are Philip David and his wife Sarah. Sarah died in 1750 and Philip in 1801, aged 79. His will shows that Philip David owned land in another parish whilst farming at Blaenpibydd, which he rented. He was well off and left £200 to be shared between his 4 granddaughters by his son John Philip, £100 to his son Thomas, and his farms to his grandson Philip Phillips and Morgan Phillips, with the rest going to his son John's education and maintenance. He seems to have married a second time, as in his will he has a living wife called Mary, though she's not mentioned on the inscription. His son John is buried here with his wife Frances, who outlived him. The inscription tells us that in April 1825 John was in good health and farming with his servants, then returned home about 12 o'clock, suddenly fell and expired. It does not tell us his age. He died intestate, leaving £600 to his wife. Leaning up against it is this stone to Benjamin Phillips of Blaenpibydd, who died on October the 5th, 1794, aged only 5 years, probably the son of John and Frances. This stone remembers John and Frances's daughter Elizabeth, who married Thomas of Cilrhedyn. She died in 1829, aged 32. Frances died in 1833. Her will leaves her son Philip Phillips 1 shilling and Morgan Philip, now the Reverend Morgan Philip, 1 shilling, with the words, "in case he will come to claim it." So they were cut off with a shilling, not out of spite I'm sure, but because they had inherited farms through their grandfather's will. She also cut off her grandchildren by her late daughter Sarah with a shilling. I'm not sure if they were provided for by other means. And to Anna Thomas, daughter of Elizabeth, her other deceased daughter, she left a piece of furniture. A grandson, Thomas, also got a shilling. Everything else, goods, chattels, and her share in the profits of Blaenpibydd Farm, she left to her unmarried daughter Frances. Frances had, it appears, stayed at the farm to help her widowed mother, and so given up the prospect of marriage, but she had done well out of it. With a farm tenancy and the money, she could now marry, and she did. Her husband was Evan Thomas, born in Llandafriog. Marrying later in life, she was probably in her 40s by then, meant that Frances had no children. She and Evan farmed at Blaenpibydd until their deaths in 1866 and 1867. Blaenpibydd was at this time 2 farms. While Evan and Frances farmed one, the other was farmed by a different family, the Lewises. James and Anna Lewis had 120 acres of land at Blaenpibydd and 9 children. Sarah, Mary, Morgan and James are buried here, all dying in their 20s and 30s. Esther and Jane, their daughters, never married and stayed on the farm to help. Their son John did the same. A grandson, John Williams, presumably born to one of the deceased daughters, lived with them from the 1860s and then became their heir. In the 1901 census, he and his wife Anna were farming at Blaenpibydd without any of their previous generations, and they had 3 children, Owen, Henry and James. 2 of their children, Esther and David, are buried here, dying in 1901 and 1902, both only 1 month old. John died in 1905, aged 52. His widow lived until 1949, dying at the age of 81. John's uncle outlived him by a year and is buried here with his oldest sister, Elizabeth. John Williams was a member of the Congregational Church. His funeral was conducted by the minister at Rehoboth and the rector of Cilrhedyn, the Reverend Daniel Llewellyn Davis. The rector lies just across the path from John Williams. He was rector here for 7 years until his death in 1911, aged 64. He had 3 brothers who were all rectors in nearby parishes, and his son followed his father into the church. From farmers who had prospered to those who scratched a living from a small parcel of land. John and Mary Bowen lived at Penrhyn, a small holding of about 9 acres near Morgan. 3 matching headstones in a row, all to the next generation of Bowens of Penrhyn. John and Anna were there for several decades and had 9 children, too many to be supported by such a small farm. They would have had to go into service in surrounding farms as soon as they were old enough. By 1871 their luck had changed, and John Bowen is described in the census as a landowner and farmer of 20 acres. His wife died in March 1877, aged 65. His son, also called John, dying 5 months later, aged 32. John Bowen died in 1891, aged 86, by which time he had left Penrhyn for his son James to farm, and was living with Anne, his youngest daughter. Anne had married David Hughes, a road labourer for the Rural District Council. They lived at Garreg Lloyd, Morgan, and are buried next to the Bowens. They died in the 1930s, and all 3 of their children died before them. Anna died in 1884, aged 11 months. John in 1897, aged 12, and their last child, Mary, died in very tragic circumstances in November 1900, aged 13. Anna had left Mary in the house alone, and she fell backwards into the fireplace where a fire was burning and injured her head. Despite frequent visits from the doctor, Mary died 3 weeks later. Just down the hill from the churchyard is the little settlement of Cumkeith. This was part of the estate of the Howells of Glaspant. Pontkeith was a smithy, and in the early 19th century the Thomas family lived here. David Thomas was a smith, as was his son. David Thomas Jr. died in 1838, aged 30. He is buried here with his brother Thomas, who died in 1846, aged 28. Their father, David Sr., died in 1851, aged 71. Next to them lies Sarah Thomas, David's wife, who died in 1860, aged 76, with another of her sons, James, who died in 1853, aged 27, and her daughter Elizabeth, who was longer lived, dying in 1902, aged 80. The inscription tells us that Sarah was the sister of the Reverend John Evans and mother of 2 other ministers, Samuel Thomas of St Clair's and Michael Thomas of Wootton Bassett. Around 1870, Pontkeith became the Fox and Hounds Inn, so called because it was a frequent meeting place for the local hunt. The Rees family, originally from Kenarth parish, ran it. Michael and Sarah Rees had 8 children, including Benjamin Rees, a haulier, who died in 1919, aged 49. His mother Sarah died the following year, aged 82. Her husband, the innkeeper, had died in 1913, aged 81. Also remembered on this stone, their son Daniel, who died in 1900, aged 32, and on an adjacent stone, their eldest son, who died in 1887, aged 26. These parents outlived almost all their sons, but their married daughters and grandchildren and one son, David, a stonemason, lived with them at the Fox and Hounds. He kept it after their death and is buried nearby. David died in 1955, aged 75. The Fox and Hounds is now a private house. This monument is to the Phillips family of Velindre in Cilrhedyn parish. John Phillips rented the mill from Colonel Trafford of the Pant Howell estate. He died in 1847, aged 64. 2 of his infant children, William and Janet, are buried here. They died in 1823 and 1833, aged 6 months and 2 years. His widow Mary and sons Benjamin and Thomas stayed at Velindre and farmed the 35 acres that came with the mill. Neither son married. Mary died in 1866, aged 85, and her two sons did not live long afterwards. Benjamin died in 1871, aged 62, and Thomas in 1874, aged 48. Mary Evans lived in Llanboidy, and her headstone came from there too. This style of stone cutting is common around that area, and it's different to the other headstones here, having a very large name and using different lettering. She lived at Dyffryn Pedryn and was a widow, farming with her sons Joshua, David and Samuel, and her daughter Rachel. She was born in Cilrhedyn and must have expressed a wish to be buried here, though no one else from her immediate family seems to be buried with her. The Jones family farmed Wrongleed throughout the 19th century. This broken stone is to Esther Jones, who died in 1819, aged 52. Thomas Jones died in 1848, aged 64. Also remembered on his headstone are two of his children who died in their infancy. Thomas, 1 year and 6 months old, who died in 1823, and Anna, who died in 1842, only 3 days old. They had 10 children, and this stone is in memory of Thomas's widow, Anna, who survived him for 53 years. She died in 1891, aged 92. In May 1899, 2 of her daughters died, Eleanor, who was 75, and Mary, 67. Next to these stones is one to her son, Griffith, who farmed a nearby farm called Pertha Havod. He and his wife Mary seem to have been childless. They died in 1885 and 1890, aged 48 and 65. Griffith's brother David Jones continued at Wrongleed until his death in 1908, aged 81. His brother Joshua died the following year, aged 70. Farming in this period was backbreaking work. It seems to have taken a toll on the men particularly, who often died long before their wives. Large families were the norm, and it was expected that some children would die. Tuberculosis was common and often took those in their 20s who'd made it past childhood. I hope you found this look at the graves here interesting. Please remember to click the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps the videos to be found more easily on YouTube by other people. Thank you to those who've subscribed to my small channel. It helps a lot. Diolch yn fawr iawn.